If I gave you an extra day this week, what would you do with it? Could be post-pandemic, pre-pandemic, or now. If I gave you an extra day, what would you do with it? I think this question actually tells you a lot about what brings meaning to your life. You might say, man, I'd spend it with one of my kids, or I'd spend that extra day with my spouse or my girlfriend or my boyfriend, or I would spend that extra day working on that project I really want to do. What would you spend that extra day on? It really speaks to meaning. Maybe you feel like, you know what, Jeff, I'm not sure what I'd do with that extra day. I mean, I guess I'd just do the same thing I did today. Maybe it speaks to you about a lack of meaning and needing to reprioritize in your life. Because you see, we're looking at 2020 learnings. We're looking at what we've learned in 2020. And the learning that I want to look at today is that there's something that you and I are rethinking. You and I are rethinking how we use our time. As we've going through this pandemic, we're rethinking time. And on the other side of the pandemic, how can you reprioritize your time to bring more meaning? Because here's the thing. I think when it comes to time, we've never been in such a time where we can really just analyze how we spent it and how we want to spend it. In fact, experts are saying the pandemic is changing how we see time. You know, our brains are wired to remember the past and decide what we want to do with the future as we look ahead. But the challenge is the past, when things were normal, is getting harder and harder to remember. And the future is never been more difficult to figure out. And between those two things, our minds are going and going and going. It's part of why we're so fatigued a lot of the time. But we're rethinking, as we move forward, how we'll use our time. For example, you might be rethinking about working from home. I'm personally rethinking that. Wow, there's some value to this. I'm actually more efficient. It cuts down time when I'm not driving back and forth from the office. I might spend more time working from home. And a lot of people are looking at their lives that way. Leslie and I have been able to spend more time with our boys at home. And we used to have a pretty busy life, driving from activity to activity. And we're starting to ask ourselves the question, hey, maybe we want to spend more time with them. Don't get me wrong, isolation together all the time isn't just roses and rainbows. But the truth is that, yeah, there is something about spending more of this time together. We're all rethinking our time. There are activities that you miss that when you get to do them, you thought, man, I never realized how meaningful that was to me. Had a conversation with some people the other day about just the meaningfulness of running into people and having a conversation. And man, that's something I want to look at doing more in my life, is connecting with people. We're rethinking how we use our time. And the question that we're asking underneath it all that I want to try to answer today is this: how do you use your time to create more meaning? How do you use the time you have? How do you reprioritize it? How do you look at it in a way where it's meaningful, where it brings you satisfaction in your life? And when we talk about time, I'm going to start at a place that you probably don't expect. It's not a place that I expected, but it's a particular word I want to start with that I think our culture looks at in a very disdainful way. And I think it's important that we talk about it. And it's this word, laziness. Laziness. Now, here's the interesting thing about laziness. In North American culture, it would be very odd for us to describe ourselves as lazy. If I said to you, sum up who you are in a word, you probably wouldn't say, well, I'm lazy. I live a lazy life. I'm a lazy person. Nobody says that. We say we're busy. We say we're overwhelmed. We say that we're productive. We talk about the job we do. For us, we would never describe ourselves as being lazy people. But as I've dug into the book of Proverbs, which is what we're looking at for this series, I've been confronted around the topic of laziness. You see, Proverbs is one of the wisdom books in Scripture, written thousands of years ago by King Solomon, one of the wisest people who ever lived. And Proverbs is a list of probabilities, not promises. If you do this, this is likely to happen. If you do this, this is likely to happen. It's so incredibly helpful. And King Solomon, who was so wise, talks a lot about laziness. In fact, page after page, there are spots where it mentions being lazy. And I want to share with you one of those passages because I think it teaches us a lot about how we can use our time to create meaning. Proverbs 24:30-34. And this is what King Solomon writes. He says, I walked by the field of a lazy person, the vineyard of one with no common sense. Now, when you look at this verse talking about this vineyard, the thing you need to know is that the Bible, when it was written, was really an agrarian culture. People were running farms, they were gardening, and not to sell the produce necessarily, but just so that they could be satisfied personally. They could fill their stomachs so they could eat. So throughout Scripture, including thousands of years later with Jesus, what you have are all of these metaphors, illustrations around the agrarian culture. Planting, reaping, sowing, harvesting, all of this sort of language. This is how they would make illustrations. So King Solomon's doing that. He's saying, I walk by the field of a lazy person, the vineyard of one with no common sense. Now, how did he know that? How did he know this person was lazy? He tells us. He says, I saw that it was overgrown with nettles, covered with weeds, and the walls were broken down. He sees that this vineyard is in disrepair. His vineyard is in disrepair. In some ways, it's an interesting metaphor. Sometimes I would say our lives can feel maybe not overgrown, but overwhelmed. Our schedules can feel overgrown, covered with weeds. We can feel like our lives lack meaning, like they're broken down. That's what he's getting at here. And then he says this, then as I looked and thought about it, I learned this lesson. King Solomon, what's the lesson you learned? Tell me, what's the lesson that you learned from seeing this vineyard? He said this, a little extra sleep, a little more slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest. He says, a little break here, a little extra break here, a little extra break here. And he says this, then poverty will pounce on you like a bandit. Scarcity will attack you like a robber. I've had the privilege of spending time around farms. I grew up around farms, family farms. Here's what I learned about farming, and vineyards are very similar. That when farming isn't a job, it's a lifestyle. That it's not something you do 9 to 5, there's no punch in, punch out, but it's something where you have to continually invest in what you're doing. You have to be diligent with your property. And what they do, a farmer, they don't just plant one day and harvest the next, but they have a season of planting. They have a season of harvesting. They have a time when they're plowing, a time when they're fertilizing, a time in the winter maybe when they're repairing equipment, a time where they're repairing buildings. There's a constant diligence where they continue to invest in their farm. And as a result, they're able to reap a harvest. They're able to make a living. They're able to satisfy. Now, what happened with the owner of this vineyard? He continued to just take a little rest and a little break and a little folded hands and a little sleep. And along the way, King Solomon is saying, all of a sudden, scarcity landed on him. But it wasn't that he did something one day and then had poverty the next. It's all the little moments in between. See, the opposite of lazy, we think, is work. Work, lazy. I'm working, you're not working, you're lazy. But really, in this passage, and I think what King Solomon would say, is the opposite of lazy is diligence. Someone who is diligent. Diligence is incremental, intentional, and persistent. It's investing in the things that are important in an ongoing way. Now, diligence is different than productivity. Productivity is about projects and outcomes and efficiency. But diligence is something that's happening along the way in an intentional way. My grandfather, I had the privilege of growing up knowing him and spending a lot of time with him. And he had a lot to do. He was a busy guy, but there was a rite of passage that he had for his grandkids where we got to drive the riding lawnmower and cut the lawn. I'll never forget the day he took me out back and he had this log cabin sort of shed place that he would keep his lawn tractor. And he took me in there and I got on the lawn tractor and I started it. And the first thing I did is I put it in drive and drove it into the wall instead of putting it in reverse. So if my wife were here, she would have a comment on my current driving skills, but we won't go there today. Then I pulled it out and I drove the riding lawnmower. It took me twice as long as I would take my grandfather. Took me probably twice the amount of gas, and it was like a terrible haircut. He didn't go out and redo it. He just left it as it was. For him, it wasn't about productivity. It wasn't efficient. It wasn't productive, but it was about diligence. Along the way in his life, investing in his grandkids because it brought meaning. I can't tell you the number of times I had milk and cookies at the kitchen table when he probably had 1,000 things to do, but he would sit there and have a conversation with me. He was diligently investing in the things that meant something. And I think in a world that's so focused on productivity, we forget the importance of diligence. I once said to a mentor of mine, hey, have you read this leadership book? Have you read this book on developing character? And he said to me, Jeff, books are great. You can read all the books you want. But at the end of the day, leadership and life are about discipline and diligence and incrementally, intentionally persisting what he means in the things that mean the most. King Solomon says this in another spot. He says, a sluggard's appetite or a lazy person is never filled, but the desires of the diligent are fully satisfied. So if diligence is so important, why aren't we more diligent in creating meaning with our time? Why aren't we more diligent? Why don't we, in all these in-between times, invest intentionally in the things that mean something? Why don't we organize our time so we can be diligent around investing in the things that bring meaning to our lives and the meaning to others? Well, the reason is because we're distracted. It's easy to argue we probably live in the most distracted generation of all time. Between text messages and phone calls and emails and Slack messages and all of the demands on our time and the go, 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 we end up being really distracted people. Many would argue the most distracted generation of all time. Distraction, I will go on a limb to say this. Distraction is the new laziness. Distraction is what keeps us from being diligent. Distraction is what keeps us from focusing on the things that bring our lives meaning. We're so incredibly distracted by the news cycle and the people who want our time and the social media notifications and everything coming at us. Distraction is the new laziness. It keeps us from being diligent. It's not that we're resting. It's not a little time with our hands folded and a little too much slumber. It's a little too much time on Netflix, and it's a little too much time on text, and it's a little too much time scrolling social media, a little too much time on playing video games. It's distraction along the way. Distraction is the thing that keeps us from diligence. It's the new laziness. And the result is a lack of meaning that leaves us unsatisfied. A lack of meaning that leaves us unsatisfied. Diligence over distraction brings meaning to your life. If you're writing things down, write that down. Diligence over distraction is what brings the actual meaning to your life. So why is it so hard to fight distraction? Why is it so challenging? Why? I mean, it just feels like our lives, we're always battling the distraction in our lives. We're trying to focus at work. We're trying to focus at our kids. We're trying to focus at the dinner table, but we're always trying to figure out how to manage and fight distraction. Why is it so hard? I want to take a moment and talk about our struggle with distraction. Our struggle with distraction. And it actually has to do with meaning. See, what happens is you replace long-term meaning with short-term pleasure. You replace long-term meaning with short-term pleasure. Instead of investing in the things along the way that actually create meaning in your life long-term, you pick the short-term dopamine hit or the short-term connection. It's a text message. It's posting on social media. It's liking. It's scrolling. We pick the thing that's quick, that's easy, that makes us feel good right away, instead of diligently investing in the things and the relationship and the time in our things that really mean something. There's a book called Digital Minimalism. If you've ever seen the documentary, The Social Dilemma, this is a great 2.0 of that. Real practical. It's one of the few books I've read multiple times. And Cal Newport says this in that book. He says, people don't succumb to screens because they're lazy. Because, we have to talk about screens. This is really about our phones. It's really about our devices. He says, but instead, it's not because they're lazy, but instead because billions of dollars have been invested to make this outcome inevitable. When we talk about the question, how do I fight distraction? We have to talk about the fact that these phones are in our hands. And if you read the number of times we pick them up, look at the stats on that, it will blow your mind. These phones are within arm's length of us, arm's reach almost all of the time. And in our hands, we're holding a personal computer, we're holding a video game console, we're holding a communication device. I mean, what our phones can do is more than Steve Jobs ever imagined. I mean, in his mind, it was a phone that played music that you could take poor pictures on. And now it's turned into so much more. And what Cal Newport would say is these companies have invested billions of dollars to leverage the devices in our lives to take our time. Because our time becomes their money. Now, this isn't an anti-technology message, but it is an important conversation about how do I fight distraction? As a result of that, we have to realize the power of the screens in our lives. So how do you do it? How do you fight distraction? Well, I want to share with you one of the keys today to how I think you fight distraction in your life. And this is how you do it. You identify your meaning replacements. You identify your meaning replacements. Okay, Jeff, what does that mean, meaning replacements? This makes no sense to me. I want to explain it to you. Over here, you have Slim Fast bars, Boost shakes. These are protein bars. So are these. These are what we would call meal replacements. And over here, you've got some good stuff. You got carrots, you got lettuce, you got broccoli, you got squash, a lot of things I don't like, but things that I eat. Now, if you said to me, Jeff, I missed lunch today, and I really needed the energy, I really needed the calories, so I had a Boost shake. I might say, okay, well, that makes sense. Or maybe you had a protein bar. I say, okay, well, you're trying to get through the day, and so you needed some quick calories to get you going, and so that's the avenue you chose. But you said, but then I went home and I had dinner, but I had a great breakfast and a great dinner, and I did eventually eat something healthy, but I took a meal replacement just to get through. That would make sense to me. But if somebody came to you and said, you know what, these Boost shakes, these Slim Fast bars, I mean, come on, this is super convenient. Like, I just take the top off and it's down. I mean, I don't have to cook anything. I don't have to cut anything. I don't have to clean anything. I just open and eat. You know what? This is super quick. I mean, this is short term. This is something I can get something real quickly. It's fast. It's easy. I'm actually just going to eat meal replacements. Forget this stuff over here. I'm just going to eat these all the time. If somebody told you that, you would say, that's crazy. I mean, short term, sure, this gives you a hit of what you need. But long term, this is what you really need. In our lives, we've got meaning replacements. Things that instead of being diligent about investing in the things that give us long-term meaning in our lives, we choose short-term. We choose quick. We choose easy. We choose distracted over diligent. We choose short-term over long-term. We need to identify what are the ways that we're consuming meaning replacements instead of doing things of actual meaning. I want to give you a few examples of these, and then I want to give you a couple of questions to help you identify your meaning replacements. Here's the first meaning replacement that I want to share with you. Escape, you replace engagement with escape. You replace engagement. You want to be engaged in your life. You know long-term that's a good idea. You want to be engaged in the things that are important. Engage with the people who are important. But often you substitute escape for engagement. Let's talk about rest, for example. We know rest is important. You know, you need to get proper sleep, for sure. And on top of that, there are rests that you need to take. You know, maybe for you a rest is you go for a run, you go snowshoeing, you take a nap. The goal of all of these things is to give you energy. So the idea of rest is to give you energy. The idea of taking a break is so that you come out of it more energized. But often the types of rest we take, we're not engaging, we're escaping. We're not resting, we're running. What are we escaping to? We're escaping to Netflix. We're escaping to video games. We're escaping to all of these things that on the other side we don't actually feel energized. Nobody I know ever says, you know what, I binge watched Tiger King for 4 episodes and I feel so good. I feel so energized. You know what, I just played 4 hours of Call of Duty and I just feel amazing. Like I could just take on the day. Nobody feels that way because they're not satisfying in the long run. They're meaning replacements. Where are you escaping instead of engaging? I'll give you another example of a meaning replacement. Connection for conversation. Connection for conversation. Studies are showing that we're actually replacing human conversation with online connection. Conversation is going down as connection is going up. And connection is the meaning replacement. We actually think that it means we're connected to people when we connect online in a deep way. But the studies show we aren't. Facebook did a study, and that study showed that when you post online, it makes you feel connected to people. When someone you know likes or comments, it makes you feel connected to people. You think, oh, wow, that makes social media sound like it's really good for us. Well, on the other hand, the American Medical Journal for its preventative medicine did a study and found out that actually when you use social media consistently in the long term, you feel more lonely. See, in the short term, when you post, you feel connected for a moment. But in the long term, you feel lonely. You feel both connected and isolated at the same time. I know if you're on social media, you felt that. It's because of the meaning replacement. See, conversation is how you connect with people. Conversation is how you figure out their social cues. Kids build empathy out of face-to-face conversation. Conversations on the phone, conversations face-to-face are how meaningful relationships are developed over the long term. I have the privilege of working with Joseph Swan, who's oversees our digital, our creative. He's also our really campus pastor. And I probably message with him 50 times a week. We text, we Slack, there's an email, we're messaging constantly. But around Thursday, we usually end up on the phone. Sometimes because I'm zoomed out. And we get on the phone and we spend about an hour and we have an actual conversation. And I would beg to say that when it comes to the messaging with Joseph, I've probably got no meaning out of that. It keeps things moving, keeps the church moving, we're getting things done. But the actual meaning in our relationship comes really from the conversations, from talking to one another, from hearing about his day, from being able to connect with him. There's a study by a professor named Turkle at MIT, and what she said is we just are consistently running from conversation towards connection to the point where there are a number of us who are just afraid to have conversation. We don't even know how to do it anymore. And what it is doing for us is it's creating a crisis of meaningful relationships. Where are you choosing connection for conversation? Yeah, it's quicker, it's faster, it gives you a quick hit of dopamine, like, comment, text, whatever it is, but where is the conversation in your life? And how do you build in more conversation? I'm not saying you give up connection. I'm not saying you give up the things you escape to, but are you really focused more on diligently investing in the conversation, in the engagement, in the type of meaning you want in your life? Here's another one, busy for productive. You end the morning and you think, man, I don't know what I got done, but I sure was busy. You've lost focus because you're so distracted by the notifications, the text, the email, the urgent call, that all of a sudden you haven't been productive. Busyness can make us feel good in the short term, but in the long run, we look back and think, what have I accomplished? Here's another one, perfect for present. Perfect for present. You can't be present with your kids. You can't be present with your spouse. You can't be present with your friends because you're so busy cleaning, organizing. I just can't relax unless everything is perfect. Let's be honest. We want to be people who are present. We want to be people who have relationships and conversation. We want to be people who are engaged in the things of meaning. We want to be those kinds of people. But as long as we feel like we're just going to get quick hits of meaning replacements, we're going to miss out on real meaning in the long term. So how do I choose diligence over distraction so I can find more meaning? How do I choose diligence? The first step, this is really what I want to cover today, is diligently identify your meaning replacements. Diligently identify your meaning replacements. And as you do, you're going to be able to shift them to create value in your life. I want to give you 2 questions to help you do that. Questions I want you to ask this week. You can list your activities, or you can ask yourself this question in your activities as you're doing your activities through the day. Jesus, what I'm doing here, Jesus, does this line up with what you value for me? Does this line up with what you value for me? See, if you're a Christian, the advantage you have is that, man, Jesus wants a meaningful life for you. If you aren't a Christian, man, I would invite you to investigate and discover that. But you can just say, hey, what's valuable to you? But man, Jesus really wants to bring value to your life. This is what he says in John. He says this in John 10:10. The thief's purpose is to steal and kill and destroy. We believe that there is an evil out there. There is evil that wants to distract you from having a real meaningful life. But Jesus says, my purpose is to give them, that's you, a rich and satisfying life. Not an easy life, but a life of satisfaction and a life of meaning and a life of purpose. And when we come to him and say, Jesus, this activity that I'm doing, this way I'm investing my time, is this actually bringing the kind of meaning that you want to my life? That allows us to make a change. One of the ways I've been really confronted by this is how I use Instagram. I like Instagram, but I can be kind of a passive scroller. Scroll like. I'm sure I'm the only one, but maybe you're out there and you're like me. I thought, man, how does this actually bring value to my life? The kind of thing God would want for my life. I've realized there's 2 values that Instagram brings to my life. One is it allows me to communicate with you. And number 2 is it allows parents and in-laws to see what their grandkids are doing when we post about that. But I don't spend a lot of time posting those 2 things. I spend a lot of time just liking and scrolling and being passive instead of being active, to escape instead of engaging. And so what I'm going to do is this week, I'm only going to be on Instagram when I'm posting something that I believe is going to speak to you, that I believe is going to be helpful to you, or that I believe is going to share the grandkids with their grandparents. And outside of that, I'm not going to be on Instagram because at that point, I'm distracted. I want to do the diligent thing, not the distracted thing, because that brings a satisfying life. And here's the second question I want you to ask. Does this leave me satisfied or leave me empty or neutral? At the end of this activity, do you feel satisfaction in your soul? Do you feel steps towards meaning? Or do you end up kind of feeling empty? I mean, that's the thing about meal replacements. I can eat a meal replacement and I'm satisfied in the short term, but in the long term, I'm still hungry. An hour later, I'm hungry again. It doesn't satisfy in the long term. You know, yesterday, HGTV was on at my house, and here's the thing about HGTV. You watch episodes thinking it will be different than the others, but the truth is they all are the same. And they all kind of blur together. And I had an opportunity to watch this episode on HGTV, and Leslie, my wife, wanted to go snowshoeing. And there's part of me that wanted to escape and not engage. But I knew that if I watched this episode, it would leave me feeling unsatisfied and empty. I mean, what would I have really accomplished? At the end, I would just kind of feel neutral. It wasn't a planned break where I wanted to take a break and watch something with her. It was just another thing to distract. So I ended up going snowshoeing because I knew I had to preach this message today. I'm trying to learn this too. And after that, I felt satisfied. We had a great time together. I got some exercise. Does this leave me feeling satisfied or leave me empty? Because Jesus does not want you to live an unsatisfied, empty life. Here's the truth. If you are struggling with, like, where do I even find meaning? What should I be investing in? Where do I even begin? Here's the good news for you, because this isn't just a good idea, it's good news. That Jesus says, if you want real meaning in your life, you want a guaranteed spot to get it, we can find it in him. He says this, he says, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never be hungry again. He's talking about spiritual hunger. Whoever believes in me will never be thirsty. If you're thinking, Jeff, what do I diligently need to build into? What do I diligently need to be spending my time on that I'm guaranteed will bring meaning? Diligently building a relationship with Jesus brings you meaning nothing else can. So that's a great place to begin, because all of your meaning will flow out of him. Diligence over distraction brings meaning to your time. And that's what I want for you. I want to see you invest in the things that bring you meaning. I want us to be the kind of people who aren't distracted by everything that's bombarded on us, but focused on being people who not only experience meaning, in particular meaning through Jesus, but who share meaning with those around us. Let's pray. God, I come to you, and I know that as we bring our lives to you and we say, hey, does this activity bring value and meaning, the kind of thing that you want from me, Jesus? I know that's going to be challenging for some of us as we focus on maybe even just one area. I pray you be speaking to our hearts. Your goal isn't to make us feel guilty, but your goal is for us to find freedom. And I pray that as we invest our time diligently, that we would experience more freedom and meaning in you. And I pray this in your name. Amen.